Hello 11th graders, this is Mr. Arisman. Today we're going to be talking about the roots of revolution in colonial America. So you probably know a bit about some of the events that led up to the American Revolution, such as the Boston Massacre, or taxes against the colonists and protests against those taxes, and then the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And those certainly did play an important part in causing the American Revolution, but we should also look at some of the longer-term causes of the revolution that started with the very founding of British colonies in North America. Because we can think of the American Revolution as a relationship between the colonies and Great Britain that fell apart. And like when any relationship falls apart, usually singular events are not the only cause of that breakup. There are also longer-term issues that caused, in this case, the colonies and Great Britain to grow apart. And today we're going to be talking about some of those. So this relates to the playlist on colonial North America, and the main objectives of that playlist are first to identify the major ideas of the Enlightenment period and the effect of the Enlightenment on colonial America, so that's what we'll talk about first. Then to describe the major characteristics of colonial governments, especially between 1690 and 1754, which was the start of the French and Indian War, so we'll talk about that second. And then to describe British imperial policies and the major effects of those policies on colonial America. So that's what we'll finish talking with. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the Enlightenment. The Age of the Enlightenment, as historians now call this period, began in the late 1600s and continued until 1800. So the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emphasized reason and individualism over tradition and religion. So Enlightenment philosophers thought that people could use reason to come up with solutions for society's problems rather than just relying on tradition, so just doing whatever has always been done, or relying on religion. They thought that people could use reason to come up with logical solutions to things. And they thought that we could advance knowledge through scientific inquiry, and that they also wanted to challenge political structures that were based solely on tradition or religion. They thought that just as we could solve some problems in society using reason, we could also structure governments based on reason rather than tradition or religion. So the political or Enlightenment philosophers started to challenge this idea that a king should rule over people just because of who his father was, or because he had some sort of divine right, a right from God to rule. Instead, they started to think that maybe the people should represent their own interests in government, and that people should be able to elect their own governments. Now this was a pretty radical idea at the time, and it was an idea that started to take hold, that started to become popular during the Enlightenment. So what did American colonists think about these Enlightenment ideas? Well, two political ideas of the Enlightenment in particular took root in the minds of American colonists. So these are things that colonists were talking about in taverns and newspapers. These are ideas that were in the air in the 1600s and in the 1700s all the way up to the American Revolution. And one idea that really appealed to a lot of colonists was this idea of republicanism. Now, when we talk about republicanism in this sense, we're not talking about the Republican Party of today. We're talking about an idea for a way to structure a government. And the first models of republicanism came from the ancient Greek and ancient Roman societies. And the basic idea of a republic government is that this is a society in which people have the power to elect other people to represent their interests. So rather than just a king, a monarch, having absolute control over the people they govern, the people can elect other people, so they can elect representatives that will then govern and serve their interests. And another idea that really took hold in the colonies was this fear that if a monarch had unlimited power and control, that they could use that power to take away liberty and take away the rights of of their subjects. So this is a fear that liberty was threatened by the arbitrary or random power of a monarch. This fear was especially expressed by a British group in the 1600s called the Whigs, and the Whigs started to really criticize the king for being corrupt and for abusing his power and for really undermining, taking away some of the liberties of his subjects. And these were conversations that American colonists were thinking about and having as well. And they started to think, you know, it didn't make a whole lot of sense for a king 3,000 miles away to be controlling decisions that affected them. And they thought, you know, it might be a better system for us to make those decisions ourselves. So these are some of the Enlightenment ideas that are starting to become popular in America and that colonists are starting to talk about. One very important and influential Enlightenment philosopher was named John Locke. He was an English political thinker in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And in 1690, he wrote a famous work called Two Treatises of Government. And in that, he argued that the purpose of government is to protect its citizens' life, liberty, and property. And that if a government fails to protect these rights, then it is the right of the people to establish a whole new government. Now, this language, life, liberty, and property, might sound familiar to you because it's almost the exact same language that Thomas Jefferson would use in the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He would say that all men have an inalienable right, or a natural right, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he was really borrowing the argument of John Locke. So the Founding Fathers would use Locke's argument about the purpose of government and the right for people to establish a new government if the government they had wasn't serving its purpose. The Founding Fathers would use that argument to justify declaring independence from Great Britain in 1776. So this shows how Enlightenment ideas about politics really affected the Founding Fathers and colonial thinking about government. Let's move on to the second objective of the playlist, which is to describe the major characteristics of colonial governments between 1690 and 1754. So most colonies had a royal governor who was appointed by the king or by the proprietor or owner of the colony. So the king would give a charter to someone who owned the colony, and then that person would run the colony. Except for two colonies, Connecticut and Rhode Island, which elected their own governors. But for the most part, the governor of a colony was appointed by the king. So that was the executive branch of the colonies. They also had a legislative branch, so the branch of government that would make laws. And almost every colony had a two-house legislature, and these were called assemblies. So just like our Congress today in the United States has two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, most colonial assemblies at the time also had two houses. And typically, one house, the representatives were appointed by the king, and in the other house, the representatives were elected by property-owning voters. So colonial assemblies found ways to act independently from royal governors. So they found ways to exercise control in a way that was independent from the governor who was appointed by the king. So for example, they might withhold a governor's salary until he agreed to their policies. That was one way in which they tried to act independently and have control over their own policies rather than have the royally appointed governor control them. In New England colonies, decisions about local administration were made through town hall meetings. So this was a form of direct democracy where people would gather in a town hall, have an open discussion about an issue, and then have an open vote on it. So this is really a form of direct democracy that was pretty unusual for the time. Now, there were still strict restrictions on who could vote and who could hold office in colonial assemblies. For example, you definitely needed to own property, and almost all assemblies had strict religious restrictions too, so you had to practice a certain form of Christianity in most colonies. But still, despite these restrictions on who could vote and who could hold office, still by 1775, the American colonies, their governments were more democratic than English government and just about any government in Europe as well. So really the American colonists got used to this form of democracy, or at least a type of government that was more democratic than anything else that existed at the time. So when Britain started to try to exercise more control over the colonies, you can see why the colonists would resent this, because they had gotten used to having a form of at least limited democracy where they had some control over the issues that affected their lives. So let's move on to the third objective of the playlist, which is to describe British imperial policies and the major effects of these policies on colonial America. It's important to look at the actual founding of the British colonies to see how, from their beginning, they were slightly different from the colonies of other European powers such as France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the Dutch. So all but one of the British North American colonies were not actually founded by the British government. So the only of the original 13 British North American colonies, the only one that was actually founded by the British government was Georgia. The other 12 were not founded by the British government. They were founded by trading companies such as the Virginia Company, or religious groups such as the Quakers, who founded Pennsylvania, or by individual proprietors, which we talked about as being the owner of a colony. So because most of the colonies, all but one of them, were not actually founded by the British government, in a way, they began as more independent from the British government than French, Spanish, or Dutch colonies were from their home governments. So the British government still had ultimate authority over the colonies, but because the colonies began as either trading companies or colonies established as religious groups, by religious groups, they had some sense of independence already, and this sort of an assumption that they did have control over their own affairs. So they start out with that idea right from the very beginning. So British government did try to control the colonies economically by passing laws such as the Navigation Law of 1650, which restricted all trade in and out of the colonies to British vessels only. So what Great Britain was trying to do here is make sure that the colonies were trading only with Great Britain and not other European countries, so that they would benefit only Great Britain. But while the British government tried to exercise control in some ways, it also embraced this idea of salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect, salutary means for the good of, for the health of, and neglect means to basically to ignore. So this idea is that the British government took kind of a hands-off approach towards the colonies so that the colonies could grow economically, and the idea is that if they didn't have to have strict trade restrictions, then the colonies would be able to flourish economically more easily. And the British government also took a hands-off approach towards the colonies, in that they let them select their own assemblies and make some of their own laws and collect some of their own taxes. So colonists grew accustomed to this level of economic independence, and therefore when Great Britain would try to raise revenue from the taxes or from the colonies after the French and Indian War, colonists weren't happy about this. They resented Great Britain trying to then control the colonies economically, because they had grown accustomed to this notion of salutary neglect, of being able to control their own affairs. So these are some of the roots of the American Revolution, ideas that colonists had that started really from the founding of the colonies, and laid the foundation for then the revolution. So I encourage you to think about these different roots of the American Revolution and write a thesis statement answering the following prompt. Describe 3 roots of the American Revolution that began to develop before 1754, so before the French and Indian War. Okay, thanks for listening. Have a great day.